Hello, everyone. My name is Brandon, and welcome to my home. I am an instructor with LSAT Max, and today I'm going to walk you through how to study for the LSAT. So thank you guys for showing up. It looks like there are a lot of people here. This presentation is going to be action-packed. If you have questions, you can ask them during the presentation. If you want to raise your hand in the participants box, I can call on you. You can type stuff into the chat box, but I might miss it since a lot of that stuff goes by fairly quickly with this many people attending a webinar. One other thing is there's a Q&A box, and I'm happy to answer questions at the end of today's presentation. So go ahead and type the things that you're interested in hearing about into the Q&A box. And when we get to the end of the presentation, I will definitely take your questions. I will be happy to do so. A few things first, and I think hopefully a link will show up in the chat. We have a new podcast called The Legal Level that we are very proud of. I co-host it with one of my fellow 99th percentile instructors at LSAT Max. Her name is Yelena. And there's the link. So you might want to check that out. So once again, thank you for showing up. And let me just share my screen with you here, and then we can get started. All right, hopefully you can see my screen. All right, so let's talk about how to study for the LSAT. First, and I'm sure at least for a lot of people tuning in, if you're tuning into a how to study for the LSAT presentation, it means you've done little, if any, studying for the LSAT. And so it might be a good idea for us to just cover very briefly what is on the LSAT, what you are facing up to, what you have to learn before you get to test day. So the LSAT is a test of logic and argumentation. It is much, much different than other standardized tests. That includes things like the SAT and the ACT, which tend to test math and verbal skills, or subject matter tests like the MCAT. Instead, what the LSAT is doing is, in a number of different ways, it's testing your ability to think like a lawyer. And lawyers think in a very particular kind of rule-based manner of thinking. Here is the structure of the LSAT. So this is the LSAT that in normal times you would take in a room with other people. What happened here? Okay, I think that's still up. And it would be structured like this, the normal LSAT. So the normal LSAT is 6 sections. 4 of them are scored and 2 of them are unscored. There are about 100 scored questions that make up your scaled score of 120 to 180. So first, let's briefly talk about the scored sections of the exam. There are 2 logical reasoning sections on a normal LSAT that makes up about half of your score. And in a logical reasoning section, you'll get somewhere between 24 and 26 questions. Each has a little paragraph. Usually there's an argument in the paragraph. And they'll ask you about the argument in the paragraph, like, what is the argument's conclusion? Or what's wrong with the argument? Or how could you make the argument better? Or how could you make the argument worse? So on a normal LSAT, that's about half your score. There is 1 section of reading comprehension. This tends to look most like what students have done before, especially if you're a humanities major. You've spent 4 years, or ultimately you will spend 4 years reading and comprehending what you are reading and being asked questions about it, which is good. It's good that it looks familiar, but I think that also lulls some people studying for the LSAT into a false sense of security, because it's not really just reading comprehension like you get on the SAT or the ACT or even the GRE or the GMAT, those other graduate exams. Instead, what they're really testing your ability to do is to read a judicial opinion, which is where a judge, or more likely the judge's clerk, will write out the arguments of plaintiff and defendant on a particular issue, or sometimes on multiple issues. And then the judge will decide, after critiquing their arguments, which one is right and which one is wrong, who wins and who loses. And that's usually, even though most passages on the LSAT are not legal passages, they're still requiring you to do that because they're asking you to track the arguments in the passage. That's all a very long way of saying that you should not ignore reading comp, even if it feels more comfortable than the other two sections of the LSAT. The final scored section on a normal LSAT is logic games. Logic games is the section of the exam that tends to freak students out because it looks like nothing you have done before, and it also looks like nothing you will do in law school. In a logic game, you'll get a little fictional setup, a fictional fact pattern. It might be something like 7 runners running a race. And then you'll get some rules governing that fact pattern. And they just ask you to apply the rules to figure out what happens. And so even though this is not a skill that is mirrored directly in law school, it's testing your ability to apply rules to facts, which is a whole lot of what law students and lawyers do. So it is relevant, but it's weird. And if it's something that you struggle with, then you should be happy to learn that it's generally thought to be the most learnable section of the LSAT. So if you start out with a low score, you can expect to improve significantly. So those are the 4 scored sections on a normal LSAT. There are 2 other sections. One is a writing sample. This is a take-home, and so you don't actually do it on test day. In fact, you have up to a year after test day to complete it. And this is just the only section of the LSAT that actually kind of looks like what you'll be graded on in law school. Almost all of your finals will be essay finals. And so here they're just testing your ability to write a persuasive essay. It is not graded. It's sent on to the schools you apply to without comment, and they can do what they want with it. I think they read it, but I doubt that it ends up making one of the more important pieces of your application package. And then finally, the other unscored section of a normal LSAT is the experimental section. And what the experimental section is on one of the most stressful days of your life, the members of the LSAT are using you as a guinea pig to test out questions that will count on future exams, but that don't actually count on your exam. And it's just one extra of these 3 section types. So for instance, if you had 2 logic game sections on test day, that would mean one of them is the experimental. Unfortunately, you won't know which one is the experimental while you're doing it. So you just have to try as hard as you can, and then hope that whichever one was the one that you struggled more with is the experimental section. So that is the makeup of a normal LSAT. These 5 sections are given on test day, the 4 counting sections in the experimental section, and then you have a take-home writing sample. I think I'm seeing some questions in the comments, and I'm hoping I am about to answer them, which is that thanks to the fresh hell we all find ourselves in, the LSAT has changed. The LSAT is now, and at least through June, a take-home test, a test that you're going to take at home. They call it the LSAT Flex because apparently that makes it sound nice. I don't know. But what the LSAT Flex is it's kind of a miniature LSAT. So instead of getting those 5 sections on test day, 4 sections that count and 1 that doesn't, you're going to get 3 sections on test day. Reading comp and logic games are the same. You will get 1 section of them. The big difference is that logical reasoning has been demoted. It used to be 2 of 4 scored sections. Now it's 1 of 3 scored sections. The makers of the LSAT have confirmed that they're not giving extra weight to logical reasoning in order to make it play out like it did before. It used to be worth 50% of your score. Now it's worth about 1/3 of your score. So if logical reasoning was the section you hated, then this is good for you. If logical reasoning was your favorite section, the one you did best on, it's not great for you. There is still a writing sample, but because it's a take-home, it's just you will take it at home once again somewhere down the road within a year, but you don't have to do it on test day. The scale is the same, 120 to 180. It's just you have about 75 questions that count rather than about 100 questions that count. This exam, just to give you the kind of basic details of the LSAT Flex, it will be administered at your home. You will take it either on a laptop or a desktop computer. You cannot use a mobile device to take this exam. And you will be monitored through your webcam and through your computer's microphone, you will both be subject to live monitoring by a live proctor who's watching you while you're taking the exam. They will also apparently, and I'm not entirely sure what this means, subject the recording of your exam to further review, including review by artificial intelligence, all to figure out whether or not you are cheating on the LSAT from home. Like I said, the May LSAT, which is next week, is an LSAT Flex. The June LSAT is an LSAT Flex. The makers of the LSAT have not decided beyond then if or when there will be more LSAT Flexes. So that is what you are studying. Now let's talk about what you do to study. So this presentation assumes that all of us are starting from the very beginning in studying for the LSAT. And here is, I think, the way to get yourself off on the best start. First, you should take a diagnostic exam. So with LSAT Max, either on our website or you can download our app, you can actually take the June 2007 LSAT for free without signing up for the course. And we will give you a score, and that will set a baseline for you. I think it's important to get started with a diagnostic exam for a couple of reasons. One is that it gives you a baseline. And so, and I'm going to talk about setting a target score in a second. It will be important to know the difference between those two. It sets a baseline, but it does a couple of other things. One is it just familiarizes you with the subject matter of what it is you're going to be studying, which is important. And you will learn just how different this test is once you've taken your first diagnostic exam. It is also, the point of it is to scare you, because most students come into the LSAT and they say, oh, well, I haven't done this stuff and I probably won't do that well. And then they take their first diagnostic exam and they do even significantly worse than they thought they were going to do with their low expectations to begin with. That's because, like I was talking about at the beginning, this is a test of logic and argumentation. If you were not a philosophy major who took a lot of symbolic logic courses, then you have not prepared for this exam at all. You've spent the past 20 plus years not preparing for this exam. And so, and as we go through this presentation, you're going to see you have a big hill to climb. It takes a lot of hard work to study for the LSAT. And so, like I was saying, in addition to setting a baseline score and getting you familiarized with the subject matter, the score is hopefully to motivate you to really put in the time that's necessary. So take a diagnostic exam. Again, you can do that through the LSAT Max app. Set a target score. So what do I mean by a target score? What should my score be? What is a good LSAT score? Well, a good LSAT score is the score that is going to make you competitive at the law schools that you would like to attend. And so it's different for everybody. I think the way for you to set a target score is to, and you can do this with any school, you can just Google their median LSAT score and GPA. And if you are at or above their medians in both of those numbers, then you have a strong shot of getting into that school. If you are below the median score in both of those numbers, then chances are very slim that you're going to get into that school. This is where I think thinking about the intersection of GPA and LSAT is important. Because if you are, for instance, below the median GPA at a particular school, in order to be competitive there, you're going to have to do better than their median LSAT score. It's generally accepted that LSAT counts for about 60% of the initial phase, where they're just looking at your GPA and your LSAT and determining whether or not those are numbers that they like. So it's about 60-40, which means that a good LSAT score can reasonably make up for a not great GPA. It's harder the other way around. So I'll give you my example. This was a long time ago, but I came out of undergrad with a 3.23 GPA. I went to UCLA School of Law. I did not go there because of my GPA. My GPA did not help me. I was well below their median. Instead, I got a 175 on the LSAT, which was well above their LSAT median, which ended up helping me get it. So that's a target score. It's different for everybody, but just take a look at the scores you're interested in. How do you match up with GPA, which is something that you can't do much about. If you are at or below their median GPA, then you're probably going to have to do better than their median LSAT score. then you should select a study option. Well, there are a number of study options. So LSAT Max is one of my favorites, obviously. It is an online study option. We do have a lot of live help. We do live support, which I think is important. But that is one of kind of 3 different, just broadly speaking, modes of studying for the LSAT. So there's online when you're talking about recorded lesson videos. There used to be, back in the day when the world was beautiful, there used to be classroom courses. There are not anymore. But now there are live online classes. Those can be helpful, especially for people who are not motivated to study because you have a set schedule that you can't get out of. But there's also a problem with that, which is they're not very flexible. And so depending upon your needs, you might not be able to find a classroom course that takes into account your needs. And so, obviously you have to think about that. There are also self-study books. These, I think, are only for people who are very motivated, because what it means when you do a self-study book is that a lot of your practice is going to be on you. So some self-study books will give you some homework, and I think that's helpful, but a lot of them will kind of just leave you hanging once you're done with the book. You also very often have to buy extra practice with self-study books. And so even though they seem like affordable options to begin with, they actually end up getting less affordable as you go on because you need much, much more practice. And when you're buying those extra practice books, like a lot of times if you want to get extra practice, you can buy those 10 actual official LSAT exams. That's the makers of the LSAT published books of old LSATs. Well, unfortunately, the questions are not divided up and served to you on the basis of question type or concept tested. And so a lot of what you do is just hunting around and finding the work that you need to do, which is very inefficient. So I was talking about online, and I'm going to talk to you guys a little bit about LSAT Max at the end of this. And so I won't give you my hard sell now, but LSAT Max, I think, takes the online model, and we do our best to make it so that it's not studying alone. And I'll talk a lot about that toward the end, but we have office hours, we have personalized support, and our course is lifetime access once you sign up. And so for as long as you're studying for the LSAT, you get all of that help through us. And so I would look at us as kind of a hybrid of these two, but there is not a live course that you work through with LSAT Max. So select a study option, the one that fits into your life. And now we are all going to throw up when we find out how much time we are going to put into studying for the LSAT. Before I look at this, this says create a study schedule. Let me just show you how LSAT Max does it. Anytime for each of our students, when you sign up at LSAT Max, you're going to tell us which LSAT you're studying for, and then we are going to immediately serve you a study calendar. What you will notice with this study calendar is that this study calendar lasts about 4.5 months. And really, depending upon the hill you have to climb, how far your starting LSAT score is from your target score, you may have to put in, or you probably will have to put in, a whole lot of time. Anybody who gives you the 2-week LSAT study plan, unless they're talking about reviewing after you've already taken an entire course, is not being honest with you about the amount of work it takes to study for the LSAT. So it's kind of hard to see, but if you look at, this would be studying for the August LSAT, the program has already started. In these first few months, April, May, June, all of these, and it's kind of hard to see them, but you're working through the course. So this is the lesson on argument exchange questions. But the last 2 months, the course is already over. For the last 2 months, it's all practice and review, and then taking full practice LSATs, 1 a week. I think it's very important to have both of these phases in your studies, because I don't think that you can see the kind of improvement or at least maximize your improvement without making it a two-step process, which is initially you're learning. You're just understanding the subject matter that's coming at you because, like I said, it's probably very new for you. Only after you have done all of that, then you figure out what your strengths and weaknesses are. And then the students who really see improvement are the ones who are very good at identifying their strengths and weaknesses and crafting targeted practice, and also reviewing the stuff that they're struggling with. Those are the ones who end up seeing a lot of improvement. And so if you're taking a course and like the last lesson of new material is the day before the LSAT, well, it's very hard to internalize that material by the time the LSAT happens. All of that is to say that to study thoroughly for the LSAT, for most people, is going to take about 180 hours overall. And so the question is, how do you fit that 180 hours in? Depending upon the hours of week you have to study, that will show you how long you should expect to study for the LSAT. So I've got a formula here. I know we don't like math. We're all going to law school. This is a very simple formula. But here's the deal. The formula is 180 divided by the number of hours per week spent studying. Once you make that calculation, you will know how many weeks of study you have coming at you. So I really think that hopefully you can put in 10 hours a week of studying. I think more would be better. But if you were to put in 10 hours a week of studying, 180 divided by 10, this is the very limited, narrow kind of math that I can do. What that would mean is that you would have about 18 weeks of studying for the LSAT, which is not that far off from down here, which is 4.5 months of studying for the LSAT. It's actually pretty close. If you can ramp that up, then you may be able to get through it in less time. For instance, if you were studying 20 hours a week, then you could get through the LSAT studying in about 9 weeks. This will change from course to course, depending upon which course you are taking. But this is about how it breaks down, which is somewhere around the first 100 hours should be the course. And that's also with all the homework associated with it, because any course that's worth its salt is going to give you a lot of practice as you learn new material. And then about 80 hours for the practice and review phase. So there's not a whole lot more to say about. I'm going to talk in detail about filling in this study calendar in just a moment, but that's the basic idea. That's what you have coming at you. If you cannot put in this type of time to study for the LSAT, then I think you have to be, have a realistic assessment about how much you're going to improve. Anybody who tells you there's 3 weird tips that will help you destroy the LSAT is lying to you. The LSAT is a difficult exam that requires you to learn to think in a new way. And that will take time and it will take effort. So like I was saying, really there's 2 phases. These first 3 months up here, these are all phase 1, and that's where you're learning and doing a lot of homework. There's not a lot for me to say about how you should do that because each course will have a different take on it. With the LSAT Max course, you would work your way through the course lesson by lesson. Other courses should hopefully be such that you can make your way through the course in a rational manner as well. But I do think that no matter what course you take, it is really, really important to keep track of what you struggle with as you go through. And especially if you're if you're trying to get through studying quickly, like putting in 20 hours a week or even more, then you're going to get new concepts very quickly. And it's very hard when you have, like you learn a concept, maybe it was difficult for you, if the next day you're on to the next concept, it's very hard to lock that down. And so what you need to do, and I would just keep a running list of this, whether it's a written list or on your phone or on your computer or something, be looking for what you struggle with. That can either be because you don't understand the material, like if you're doing a course, if the lessons are not clear enough to you, or it can become exposed when you're doing homework and you start getting a lot of questions wrong. But what you want to do is to be keeping track of your weaknesses. If you do this during the course while you're learning, then it will help you hit the ground running in that practice and review phase. This is not an exhaustive list, but I think these are the things that you have to keep in mind with each of the different section types. And like I said, keep a running list of what may or may not be working for you. So with logical reasoning, the most common one is question type. Some question types give students troubles and other ones don't. But there are other concepts that are very important. Conditional diagramming. That's important. It's also, and I didn't put it down there, but conditional diagramming if-then statements is important not just in logical reasoning, it's also important for group games. So you want to keep an eye on that. Argument structure. Are you able to pick out the pieces of an argument and understand them as you're reading the stimulus in logical reasoning? So an argument always has at least two parts, premise and conclusion. Are you able to understand how they interact with one another? Are you able to identify common argument forms? There are common ways that arguments are made on the LSAT, like process of elimination is a very common way that arguments make their case on the LSAT. This, I think, is super important. Common fallacies. There are what we call error in reasoning questions. Those are the most common question type on logical reasoning. And those all just present you with an argument that's a bad argument, and they ask you to explain how the argument is bad. There are very common ways that arguments go wrong over and over again. So the makers of the LSAT will change the subject matter, but the structure, the flaw that the argument is committing is the same. We actually recently added to the LSAT Max course a unit on 33 common fallacies that show up over and over again on the LSAT. That's important not just for answering those error and reasoning questions, but it's also important for answering questions that require you first to be critical of an argument. So questions that ask you to strengthen or weaken an argument, or questions that ask you what is necessary to an argument. All of those have flawed arguments in the stimulus. And your first step is to identify what's wrong with it. So this is really, really important. I think it also helps you be critical of arguments in reading comprehension, which is important. But if you don't have those memorized, or if you're struggling in identifying them in question types, that's a weakness that you should document and make sure that you're taking care of it. Also, causal arguments. Those are common on the LSAT. You have to know how to strengthen and weaken them. For logic games, here are the things that really tend to throw people for a loop. Just identifying the type of game you're doing. If you don't know what is the process you're being asked to do, that can be a problem. Sometimes people say, I know what game I'm doing, but I don't know how to build a setup that reflects the game accurately. So that's a thing to keep track of. Are you building the setup correctly as you're approaching a game? If you're not, then that's something you need to work on. Symbolizing rules in a way that that is standardized, that you do over and over again. Scenarios, we call these guru games. That's when there's a game that has one rule or one variable, and if you try out all the ways that it can work, you can actually get a roadmap of the game. You have all of the possibilities of how the game could work in front of you. So that can be very important. Numerical distributions, I'm not going to get into that right now because it takes some time to explain, but when you're doing your LSAT course, you will come to that, and if you struggle with it, you should stay on it. With reading comprehension, again, don't let reading comprehension fall by the wayside. A lot of people do. I think more than logical reasoning, subject matter can really be a problem in reading comprehension. So if you struggle, for instance, with science passages, then you should note that, and you should learn scientific terminology and do a lot of extra practice, specifically with science passages. Question type. The questions in reading comprehension are just logical reasoning questions, just applied to a longer stimulus, basically. So if you're struggling with a particular question type in reading comprehension, then you should actually review the material on that question type and logical reasoning, which will be helpful. Comparative passages, ever since 2007, one of the 4 passages is actually 2 shorter passages. The skill set to address those is a little bit different. Tagging, by which I mean taking notes as you're reading the passage. They've made this much more complicated since it went from a pencil and paper test, which I think is unfortunate. But do you have a reasonable and quick method of writing down what is important for you to know and not go back to the passage? And then argument structure. In a reading comprehension passage, there's usually multiple arguments being made. Are you able to track the different premises and conclusions? Can you see what the author thinks about a particular argument? If you're not tracking argument structure, that's something that you need to know. So all of those things, regardless of which course you're doing, are things that you should be tracking as you go through the course. If you know you struggle with something, you can't just move on to the next subject and forget about it. At some point, you're going to have to tackle it. And that point is the practice and review phase. So let me move back up to the calendar really quickly, just to show you something. So that's basically the last 2 months of the course. Unfortunately, as I expand this, it becomes a little bit blurry. But what you'll note is that we have ruined every weekend for you by forcing you, and you don't have to do this on these particular days, but in the practice and review phase, we recommend taking at least 1 full practice exam a week and reviewing it. And then on the days in between, you should be doing a lot of practice and review, most of it full-time sections, but there will be other stuff that you can do. But note that when we ask you to take a practice LSAT, we're asking you to take it on Saturday and then review it on Sunday. Review practice LSAT. And that's true for each of these. And that takes up a full day of study, each one of them. And I will explain why right now. So before we get to this stuff, there's kind of a phase 1.75. Where did I put it in here? I think it's important once you get to the end of phase 1 and you've figured out which of these things are your weaknesses, before you get into this practice and review phase, you should review your weaknesses. And what I mean by that is you just go back to the materials in whatever system it was that you were doing associated with that weakness. So that might be lesson videos. That might be information in the book. That might be flashcards that you made. That might be notes that you took during your course. And just make sure that you're not missing anything from that information. Because a lot of times, the reason why you struggle with a concept is not so much that it's difficult, as that there was a particular bit of instruction that maybe you forgot about because it was just buried under everything else that came after it. And so I think it's really important between phase 1 and phase 2, when you're shifting from making it through the course to doing a lot of practice, that you stop and identify your weaknesses. I would also spend some time on these just practice and review days. I would spend some time doing untimed practice on your weaknesses. So if it takes you, 5 minutes to do a logical reasoning question, that is the question type that you struggle with, then I think that's fine. Have the materials out in front of you with those question types that you struggle with. People always think that's cheating, but if you have the book out in front of you while you're doing a particular kind of question, then ultimately what you're trying to do is internalize the instruction on that question type. In addition to that kind of generalized or, well, I guess it's not generalized, it's targeted review, you should be doing a lot of timed practice. So that includes taking one full practice exam per week. It also includes taking full sections, although not necessarily a full exam, at other times during the week. So everything that I'm about to talk about right now derives from this, which is reviewing should lead you to be able to answer a question that presents the same concept in a different context, in different subject matter. It should allow you to figure out how to answer that question correctly next time. And so if you'll note, there are 3 questions to ask yourself for each question you got wrong. And I think the first 2 are helpful, but the third one is where students start to think creatively. And if you're really answering the third question, that's when I think you start to see score improvement, not just improvement in understanding, but being able to execute under time pressure. And so these are the questions you ask yourself. Why was my answer wrong? In my own words. Why was the correct answer correct? In my own words. And then, and most importantly, how could I have anticipated the correct answer? The students who see the most success on the LSAT are the ones who, before they get to answer choice A, have an anticipation of what the right answer will look like, most times. Sometimes you can't anticipate, sometimes your anticipation will not be correct, but if you are anticipating, the better you get at it, not only are you more likely to get questions correct, but they will also take less time, because if you know what the answer choice should look like, you can quickly scan for it and find it. But if you're just wandering through answer choices looking for one that hopefully fits the criterion of the question, that's going to make life much more difficult. I'm going to talk about all of this in connection with the different sections, but all of these bolded ones, like this, is how you answer that question. How could I have anticipated the correct answer? How you should be thinking about answering that question with regard to a particular section type. Here is what you are going to do when you do that full diagnostic or practice exam. And you are not going to like this, but it is what you should do. You should take a full 5-section exam. If you're studying for the LSAT Max, you don't have to do that. And in fact, I'm just studying for the LSAT Max. Studying for the LSAT Flex, you don't have to do that because it is a 3-section exam. And in fact, LSAT Max has rejiggered our web portal so that you can take any of the old exams in LSAT Max, LSAT Flex format. So you don't necessarily have to take a 5-section exam if you're studying for the LSAT Flex. But take the exam, put it aside, don't grade it. The next day, before you grade it, take the exam again. Do not time yourself. Instead, allow yourself to take as much time as you want and answer all the questions again. Once you have done that, grade the timed answers that you gave. So your first performance. And what is especially important, and the reason that we have you do this, this is what some people call blind review, is that you should be especially focused on the answers that you changed from one LSAT to the next, and especially the ones that you went from getting wrong the first time to getting right the second time. And so what you're saying to yourself is, what mistake did I make that wasn't even a mistake that I would necessarily have to make? This helps you point up what are the, I don't want to call them dumb mistakes, but the ones that are not so much an issue of understanding as they are an issue of you not approaching the test in the best way possible. Review the questions you got wrong. You don't have to review the questions you got right. Focusing especially on those you changed to correct answer without timed pressure. When you are reviewing a logic game section, this is whether you're taking a full exam or if you're just taking a section on one of those practice and review days. If you finished a game perfectly on time, put it aside. For all of the other games, and here's where you're determining how could I have anticipated the correct answer. What did you miss? Usually, what you missed is that there was a rule or a combination of rules that gave you a deduction that you did not make. You might have also missed an opportunity to create scenarios, which is very important on some of these games. And so what you have to do is to say, okay, what did I do wrong? Then do the game again and do it right this time. And what you will be doing is definitively teaching yourself what was the point of that game. I know that this sounds like it takes a long time, and it does. But I think to really start to see improvement, this is the way to do that. So that's reviewing logic game section. When you review a reading comp section, the process is similar. Put aside any passages that you finished perfectly on time. For the other passages, and this is again trying to anticipate both the questions coming at you and the answers to those questions. What did you miss in the passage that was important? And this, I think, is easier with reading comp than it is with most of the other questions, which is very often once you see what is the right answer, you'll see the tag that you missed, the piece of the passage that was important, but that you did not identify. In addition to just what were the tags, I think it's really important with reading comprehension to be thinking broadly in terms of argument structure. So did you identify all of the conclusions in the passage? Did you identify the support for them? Did you identify the criticisms to the extent that there were any? Because all of those are going to be tested. If you missed it once, you have to make sure that you're not going to miss it the next time. And once again, the passages that you didn't get all of the questions right, do those passages that you missed again, and make sure you understand how the tags are supposed to work. With the logical reasoning section, put aside the questions you got right. For each question you missed, a couple of things. Did you correctly identify the question type? That tends to throw students off. If you don't know what question you're doing, it doesn't matter how well you can read the stimulus or read the answer choices. You don't know what the question is asking you. Did you miss a common argument form or one of those common fallacies? If so, go back to your notes or your flashcards. Memorize that common fallacy. Be actively looking for it, not just in error and reasoning questions, but in other questions where arguments are often flawed. Is it a conditional diagramming issue? You may have to go back and review stuff about conditional diagramming. And so again, when you figure out what you did wrong, do these questions again. And the idea is to be able to anticipate the correct answer when you see another question that looks like this structurally, but is of different subject matter. All right, that's the phases of studying. We have one more topic left to cover, and it's, I think, a little bit different than how to study for the LSAT, because it's more or less how to take the LSAT. You may have noticed, if you have taken a practice exam, that each of the sections on the LSAT is 35 minutes, and especially with reading comprehension, but with all of the sections of the LSAT, that's not a lot of time. And so with a lot of students, I don't know how many times I've heard the common complaint, well, if I had as much time as I needed, I could, get a 180 on this exam or a 175 or something like that. But obviously you have to do this stuff under time pressure. The reason that we included, and I'm going to talk through it, the reason we included this here is because a lot of courses don't give you this information. They don't tell you about how to manage your time on the section. Instead, what they do is they give you the information needed to answer questions correctly, the subject matter, but they don't give you the tactics, the stuff that's going to get you those questions under time pressure. So what I'm about to say, and I have a little bit of information, although much less, unfortunately, about reading comprehension, a little bit of information about managing your time on each of the section types. The theory behind all of this is this. Let me just give myself a little space here. So let's say this is an LSAT section. Does not matter which section we're talking about. This could be games, it could be reading comp, it could be logical reasoning. Most LSAT sections, well, all of them really, proceed in this manner, which is that they tend to start off, the earlier questions are a little bit more straightforward, if not easy. They get harder toward the end, but the peak is not right at the very end. Instead, the peak is like, I don't know, 5/6 of the way through the passage or through the section, something like that. So this is where the really ugly questions are coming in. The idea behind everything I'm about to tell you now is that the way to manage your time on the LSAT intelligently, or the only way that I found to manage my time intelligently on the LSAT, is to get good at skipping around, to become comfortable with skipping questions. And in other words, to make it so that you're not doing the questions in the order that the makers of the LSAT want you to do them in, because they're not giving you that order to help you. They're giving you that order to hurt you, to make the test harder. Instead, you want to do the questions in the order that is best for you, meaning you're picking up all of these points, picking up all of these points, and maybe not even attempting these hardest questions. Because unless you demand a 180 on the LSAT, you're going to get questions wrong, and it's fine. You can miss 10 questions and still score in the 170s very often. So the idea is to possibly not even try the 10 hardest questions and then ace the other ones with the time that you have saved. Now, one big caveat about this is that when I say this is how these sections usually go, that's an average. And so question, let's say it's, I don't know, question number 5 right here. On average, question number 5 is easier than, I don't know, let's say this is question number 21 up here. That doesn't mean that every single question 5 in history has been or will be easier than every single question 21. They can give you a nasty question number 5, and sometimes they will do that. It's just that on average, you are less likely to see a nasty question at 5 than you are at 21. And so everything I'm about to tell you, you can't just automatically assume that a question you're doing is easy because of where it comes in the section. It is more likely to be easy at question 5. That doesn't guarantee it. This theory, skipping the hard questions and doing the easier questions first, proceeds a little bit differently depending upon which section you're doing. And so I'm going to start with logical reasoning. With the exception of the LSAT Flex, it's the most important one. But here is first the pace, and then I'll talk to you about how to skip around. So with questions 1 through 10, since they tend to be a little bit more straightforward, I would do about 60 seconds per question. If you were to divide up a 35-minute section, what you'd find is that you get about 90 seconds per question if you were going to address each question in the same amount of time, but you don't want to do that. And so what we're doing here is banking time on easier questions in order to spend them on harder questions. Questions 11 through 20, right around 18, 19, 20, that's when they start to get really nasty. But these guys, for the most part, you should expect to spend about 90 seconds per question on these questions. They're a little bit harder, although usually the hardest stuff is right at the end of this portion of a section or at the beginning of the next portion. And then finally, those last questions where they tend to really put the doozies, 21 through 25 or sometimes 26. If you bank time on these other questions, you should have about 2 minutes per question to spend on any one of these questions. For questions 1 through 10, I'm going to talk to you about questions that you'll just skip the second you see them, but don't use that here. On questions 1 through 10, attempt every single one of the questions. You shouldn't plan to skip any of them, because even the ones that would fit one of these skipping criteria over here might still be simple enough for you to get quickly and to get correct. But if you find that a question is hard, you need to be able to bail on it very quickly. You do not want to spend, especially you don't want to spend a lot of time on a hard question early in a section, because that can throw the whole section for you. So that's the pace. In these next 2 parts, when you come across this stuff in the right-hand column over here, you may want to just skip it. without even attempting it. You'll note that on all of these, I say, consider skipping. So this is, like I was talking about earlier in the presentation, the students who end up doing the best are the ones who categorize their strengths and weaknesses and who know what those strengths and weaknesses are. So if I'm over here telling you to skip one of your strengths, don't do that. If one of these things is your strength, don't skip it. But these are things that often students struggle with. And so you may want to consider, is this something, knowing how I take the exam, that I would want to skip? These guys, parallel and parallel error in reasoning questions, those ask you to analyze 6 arguments rather than 1. And a lot of times they just take up a whole lot of time. And so you don't want to spend a lot of your time on them. Question type weaknesses. If, for instance, you just can't deal with paradox questions, well, then maybe skip them and come back to them. This can be a problem if you're talking about the more common question types like flaw questions or strengthen questions, because that would mean you're skipping a lot of questions. You don't necessarily want to do that. But especially the more rare question types, there's a question type you hate, skip it and come back to it. It is trivially true that the subject matter doesn't matter on the LSAT, that it's about the structure of the thing that you're reading, but you can't understand the structure of what you're reading without understanding the subject matter and the language. And so, especially, and this is true, especially a lot of times for English as a second language students, you don't want to get bogged down on something that's very difficult when the next question will be straightforward, even if the reasoning behind it might be difficult. So if that's something that slows you down or ruins a question for you, then just don't do the question that has the, I don't know, if you don't like science, skip the science questions and come back to them. Concept weaknesses. When I say concept, I mean like argument structure, like I was talking about before. And really, a lot of this is the stuff that we were talking about up here, these weaknesses that you're tracking. Where'd that go? These things here. So this, when you're tracking these weaknesses, this can help you figure out what to skip on test day and what not to skip, because you know what your strengths and weaknesses are. But concepts include things like argument structure or common fallacies or causal arguments. Conditional diagramming. Conditional diagramming, some people struggle with. Also, it's the case that with conditional diagramming, it can take a while. And so, especially if you're slow with it, you might want to consider skipping conditional diagramming questions. Any brutal question, anything that is going to take up a lot of time and you might still get it wrong, do that one last. So that's logical reasoning. I think there's a lot you can do to maximize your time there. I think logic games is the most time hackable section of the test. So I have a lot of information here that I think is going to be helpful for you. You're going to be sad when we get to reading comp and see that there's not as much I have to offer you. But logic games. So managing your time on logic games is very important. I think it is entirely possible to have a 3-game strategy where you only do 3 of the games on test day and still get a very good score on logic games. And the reason is this. So if you do just 3 games and you do them very well, there is the first question almost always in a game is what we call the elimination question. You can knock out 4 answer choices that violate a rule and find the right answer. And so those questions you can get right without having done the setup. And so on the game you skip, you can do the elimination question. If you are guessing all the same answer choice, for instance, maybe C is your answer choice, you'll probably get 1 out of 5 or about there of the questions that you skip anyway. And so it's entirely possible if you do well on 3 games, you get the elimination question, and maybe you get a lucky guess on one of the questions on the game that you skipped. It's possible to get a 20 on logic games without having done all of the games. Now that means you're acing those other 3 games, but I think it is possible. And so if you find that you're rushing through 4 games, you may want to try out on your next practice exam a 3-game strategy. I'll talk about that in a second, but that's just the difference between them. If you are going to attempt all 4 games, this is the winning pace. Again, the earlier games are probably more straightforward. Games 1 and 2 on average are easier than games 3 and 4. So you should expect to do games 1 and 2 and to bank time on them. If you were to separate the section out into 4 equal parts, you would get 8 minutes and 45 seconds for each game. If you're doing games 1 and 2 in about 15 minutes, that's about 7 minutes a game, which means you're banking time for the later games. You should look very briefly at the other 2 games after you finish those and try to determine which one is easier and do that one first. Now this might, there's a couple of ways to figure out what is the easier game. If it's a particular game type that you're better at, then you should probably do the game type that you're better at. Students tend to think that games with less rules are easier. I actually think it's the opposite. I think games with more rules tend to be easier because the options are more limited. If there are very few rules, then games are very open-ended. And so that might be a good way to determine which is the easier game. Try to get through that one in about 9 minutes, which leaves you about 11 minutes for the harder game. It can happen sometimes that you put in the work to do the setup that you thought was the easier game, and now you're looking at it and you think, actually, this game is not that easy. I think this game is harder than I thought it was. I think if you're doing all 4 games, it's perfectly fine to get that far into a game where you've done the setup and maybe made some deductions, and then go do the next game and come back to it, because all of your work will be available there for you. It's not like any of that work is wasted. If you're doing all 4 games, you're going to use it eventually. You would have to refamiliarize yourself very briefly with the subject matter of the game because you will have cleared your cache and moved on to a different game type. But I don't think there's a problem with that. The only problem with the 3-game strategy is figuring out which is the easier of the games, the last 2 games, because this time you're going to skip one. And so you definitely want to do the easy one, hopefully, and skip the hard one. But this is the pace that you should be on for a 3-game strategy. Get through games 1 and 2 in about 10 minutes each. That will leave you 15 minutes for the remaining questions. You should spend about 13 minutes of that on the game that you're actually going to do. But then you definitely need to leave yourself a minute or 2 to address that elimination question on the game you skipped, and also to make sure you bubble in all the answer choices. There's no guessing penalty on the LSAT, so you should always guess. The particular question types that you should think about skipping and coming back to, whether that's getting to the end of that particular game and coming back within the game, or getting to the end of the section and then coming back to a game that you have already left. That's up to you, how you want to do that. But these are the guys that I think you should probably skip when you see them. The rule replacement question. A lot of times the last question of the game will say, imagine that this rule goes away. Which one has the same effect on the game? These tend to be a giant time suck, and I would probably skip them. They don't do this very much anymore, but they used to add a variable sometimes on the last question. There was a car wash game years ago, and the setup was great, and you do some scenarios, and it's a 5-slot game, and then in the last question they say, assume Gibran is also getting his car washed. And what happened with that question is that the scenarios you created, all of the work you did, all of your deductions were all garbage because it's no longer a 5-slot game, now it's a 6-slot game. And what they wanted you to do was to redo the whole game to get that 1 point. And you just, it's not worth it. If you have time at the end after you've gotten all the other points, that's fine, but you do not want to spend 4 or 5 minutes on one question. And then just any question that is brutal, get away from it. A couple of more things. I know we're already at an hour here, but just a few more things before I take your questions. With logic games, I think it's a great idea to do conditional questions, the if questions first. Again, you're doing questions in the order that is most helpful to you. The reason is that when you've constructed a hypothetical, if you've done it correctly, you found something that could be true of the game, and it can be used on other questions. And so let's say we're in a sequencing game and we found out question number 3 says, I don't know, if D finishes 3rd, which one of the following could be true? And we do all of our work and everything gets filled in, and we find out that this is one way that this game can play out. I answered question number, 16 with this hypothetical. But there's another question, and maybe I can use this information on another question. So there's a couple of ways you can do that. if it happened in a hypothetical, it could be true. It's unlikely that they will do this, but it happens every once in a while. You might actually have the answer to a further could be true question. If, for instance, question number 14 said, which one of the following could be true? And it was answer choice C said A finishes last. Well, that would be the right answer because I know A could finish last. I've seen it. They don't do that much, but what they do, and how these are very helpful, is that anything that could be true is the wrong answer to a must be false question. So if conversely it said, which one of the following must be false, question number 18, and answer choice C says A finishes sixth, well, that's wrong. That doesn't have to be false. I've seen it work. So you can get rid of answer choices fairly quickly. You can also use hypotheticals in a little bit different of a way, and this is going to start to get abstract, but I hope that you can follow me. If something did not happen in a hypothetical, that means it could be false. They could give you a further could be false question where they would just give you the right answer. So let's say number 18 says, which one of the following could be false? And it says, I don't know, C finishes first. Well, that would be the right answer. That could be false. I've seen B finish first and C finish fifth, but they're unlikely to do that. Instead, you will likely be able to get rid of wrong answers to must be true questions, because the wrong answer to a must be true question is something that could be false. So if they say which one of the following must be true, and answer choice B says, I don't know, A finishes second, well, that doesn't have to be true. I've seen F finish second and A finish last, meaning it's the wrong answer to a must be true question. So this, I think, can really help you manage your time. Now let me talk to you briefly about reading comprehension. I wish I had a lot of time hacks that make reading comprehension easy to do under time pressure. I don't. And I think the reason for that is that reading comprehension is just testing your ability to read a lot and to answer difficult questions about it quickly, because that's what you do in law school. You're going to go home with 150 pages of reading. You're going to come back and be grilled by multiple authorities on those different issues the next day. And so I don't think there's a lot you can do, but I do think you can manage your time effectively. Again, generally speaking, passages 1 and 2 are going to be more straightforward than 3 or 4. So in a 4-passage strategy, the pace here is the same as games. You would want to try to make it through passages 1 and 2 in about 15 minutes. Try to make it through the easier of 3 or 4 in about 9 minutes. I think it's especially hard to determine what is easier and what is harder. With reading comprehension, I think the best way to do that is to just scan the first paragraph. Is one of those two more your subject matter? Is the language difficulty easier in one of those two? Then probably go with that one. Do the easier one, hopefully in 9 minutes, the harder one in 11 minutes. It is possible to have a 3-passage strategy. And again, I think if you're doing really well on those 3 passages and you're guessing all the same answer choice on the passage that you skip, then I think you have a reasonable chance of doing fairly well in reading comprehension without doing all 4 passages. So again, you would do passages 1 and 2 in about 20 minutes. That would leave you almost 15 minutes for the easier of passages 3 or 4, but you definitely need to save a little bit of time to fill in the answers on the passage you skipped. You might want to consider skipping these questions. The passage mentions each of the following except. These are could be false, or the way we call them is bizarro must be true questions. In other words, 4 answer choices must be true. And what they want you to do is to go back to the passage 4 times to knock out 4 wrong answers, which is a recipe for disaster. I would probably skip these, leave them till the end. And then finally, one thing that I think can be helpful is if you find yourself, especially if you're doing the 4-passage strategy, being just mentally exhausted when you get to that last nasty passage, consider doing the hardest passage first, or consider doing the passages backwards, starting with passage 4 and going to passage 1, because then you'll at least be a little bit more fresh when you're doing those hard passages. Again, I wish I had more about hacking time on reading comprehension. I think a lot of it is just how fast can you read. All right, so let me just tell you a little bit about what you would get out of LSAT Max if you were to sign up, and then I'm going to take your questions. There are, wow, a lot of them. I don't know if I will get to all of them. So like I was saying, you can download the LSAT Max app for free, or you can go to our website and take the June 2000 LSAT to get a target score. So you don't have to sign up for anything, but since you signed up for this webinar, you'll get 19% off in the next 24 hours, 10% off of that. There are a couple of different packages. Each of them has a payment plan. So it's not like you have to shell out all of this money all at once. I'd like to just tell you about what I think separates us from the competition, what makes us special. So I think what a lot of people have learned recently is that studying for the LSAT is very difficult, and it's especially difficult to study for the LSAT alone. And so we try our best to make sure that LSAT Max is a community of people studying for the LSAT together. And we do that in a couple of different ways. So like I was talking about before, we give you lifetime access. Once you sign up, you are part of the LSAT Max family forever and ever, whether you like it or not. And we will give you one of those study calendars. So I pointed it out to you to begin with. And if you're following the study calendar, you're following the same calendar as hundreds of other people studying for the exam, the same exam that you're studying for. So you're working through the course at the same time as other people are working through the course. There's more than 100 hours of lesson videos, and all those lesson videos have drills and flashcards and homework associated with them. They all have message boards associated with them, so you can talk back and forth with other students or with instructors as you're moving your way through the course. Those are the real-time message boards. We've ramped this up a lot recently, weekly office hours. I know at least up until the end of this week, we're doing office hours every day. That's when one of our instructors will lead you through a particular concept or question type on the LSAT and also take your questions. There's personalized support. So when you need help, somebody will reach out to you. Likely it will be one of the office staff first. It may be an instructor at some point. But again, once you sign up, you can become part of LSAT Max. This stuff is available to you for as long as you study for the LSAT. A couple of other things that are really important. We're always tracking your performance. That's especially important at that practice and review phase. So when I was talking about cataloging your weaknesses, we're going to do a lot of that work for you, which can be helpful. We also guarantee that you will get a higher score on test day than you got on your first practice exam, or else you will get your money back. This will become extremely important again once the LSAT is in person. Our interface looks exactly like the interface that you use on the regular LSAT. We're not entirely sure what the LSAT Flex interface is going to look like yet, so we don't know how that works. But if you are using the LSAT Max course, you're getting practice that looks like test day practice. So that is what I have to tell you about LSAT Max. I think it is the best system available. And hopefully I will see some of you guys in the LSAT Max system soon. Having said that, I am now going to answer your questions. Let's see here. I'll just start with the Q&A. So this first one, as a foreign student, I want to know that looking to the current situation, can I appear for the LSAT from sitting here in India? What if this lockdown situation won't allow me to be there in the USA this year because I'm willing to enroll for law school in 2021? What options do I have? I mean, I think your options are slim. I know the LSAT Max is not at least, the LSAT Max, the LSAT Flex, why do I keep saying that? The LSAT Flex is not being administered internationally, at least in May, and I'm not sure if it's being administered internationally in June either. So what that means is that you may either have to just wait until you can take the LSAT, or there are a limited number of schools that will accept the GRE in lieu of the LSAT. So if you can sit for the GRE, you may be able to apply to a couple of schools. There are some very good schools, like Harvard accepts the GRE for some students, but that is limited. I wish I had better answers for you, but I don't know that there are good answers right now. When is a good time to start studying for the LSAT? I'm finishing my undergrad degree. The best time to study for the LSAT is when you have the most time to study for the LSAT. It's going to consume your life for several months. And so whenever you can fit it into your life, the best is when you should study for the LSAT. So I gave some information earlier on about how much time that's going to take. The busiest season for studying for the LSAT is the summer, because most people who take the LSAT are students, and that's when they have the most time to take it. But that's up to you. LSAT scores are generally good for 5 years. Most schools will accept them for 5 years. So as long as you're finishing your LSAT, within 5 years of when you're going to apply for law school, any time is good. When reviewing practice exams, how do you recommend properly going? I think I answered this question. And in fact, there are some that I have already answered, and I'm going to, they were just part of the presentation. For those of us who have been studying 5 to 6 months, done a lot of prep tests, and are close to test date, what is your strategy to studying as the test gets closer? I think it has to be about half of that timed practice we were talking about, or more. And then I think even very late into your studies, you should always be cataloging your weaknesses every time you take a practice exam. Was there a question type that you're still not doing well on, and reviewing the materials associated with it like I was talking about. So I think that second phase lasts basically until you're done with the LSAT. Any tips on how to make studying fun, or at least to better motivate yourself, especially during the time of the pandemic? So you're gonna hate me, but I actually like logic games and logical reasoning, and so I find them fun. I don't know that I have tips on how to find this stuff fun, but let me just talk to you about how I keep engaged with reading comprehension, which I don't like and I don't find fun, which is with reading comprehension, it's very easy to tune out from a passage because it's just boring. But I think if you're reading for structure, what I call active reading, you're looking at the passage as a puzzle with pieces to pick out. Where are the conclusions? Where are the premises? Where are the criticisms? Then I think you can at least have an activity that you're engaged in, which might not be fun, but at least won't be boring because you're doing something rather than just passively reading about subject matter that is terribly boring. I used to, and I know it's hard nowadays, I used to, when I was studying, there was no pandemic and it was also all in books. I took the LSAT about 100 million years ago. And so I would just take my books to different places and study in different places to just get a change of scenery. I'd go study at a park, I'd study at the beach, study at a coffee shop. I think you can do that some, but right now, and especially with all of your homework online, that can be difficult. Let's see. Is there a chance that LSAC will be adding additional dates or changing further exams in the rest of the year to the flex option? I think that second part, changing them to flex options, I'm almost positive that at least July is going to get turned into a flex, because I don't know that they're going to be ready to administer other LSATs. I have not heard of them adding administrations though. So I have no information that would indicate there will be more LSATs, just that they will, at the very least, June will be an LSAT flex, and I would think that some of the other ones will also. What should someone who started with an LSAT score in the 130s, is there any way to bring that to the 160s? Yeah, I think there is, and it's that 180 hours of grueling struggle that I was talking about. I mean, 30 points is a big jump, but it is not an impossible jump. And I've seen students do it before. And it's much easier to go from like a 130 to a 140 than it is to go from a 170 to a 180. And so I think those earlier points, the ones, up through 150, I don't know that it's necessarily, well, I don't want to say it's not hard, it's difficult. But I don't have like a hack for you. I have the offer of a lot of hard work. Are there any brain games or puzzles that we can do outside of LSAT prep to familiarize ourselves with the mindset required by the LSAT? Sudoku kind of uses some tactics that logic games use. And so I think that's fine, but I also think the best practice for the LSAT is LSAT questions. And if you buy one of our larger packages, you're never going to run out of LSAT questions. So if what you're asking is, can I do something else besides the LSAT to study for the LSAT? If other test dates are changed to the flex test, are there any tips for studying for that test in particular? The only tip that I have is that logical reasoning has lost its status as the most important section. So as far as how you deploy your time, you might want to decrease the amount of time you spend on logical reasoning a little bit and increase the amount of time that you spend on the other sections. But I also think that, especially once you get to that second phase where you're really thinking critically about your performance, it's not so much that you're going to be like, oh, I must practice logical reasoning more because it's worth more. Instead, you're going to be finding the areas that you need work on, regardless of what section those come in, and working on those. And so that may mean that you're still putting in more time on logical reasoning than otherwise. The LSAT Flex tests all and only the same subject matter as the LSAT, so I don't think you have to worry too much about studying differently for it. How closely do at-home practice test scores resemble the scores people get on real tests? So this is a variation of the, isn't it true that everybody drops 6 points or whatever when they take a real LSAT? And the answer is that no, that is not true. Here is what I would say. Any practice exam that you have taken, if it is a real LSAT practice exam, then you have identified your capability. And you can replicate that on test day. So I scored very closely to my highest practice exam score on test day. But that means that you have to be able to put your best foot forward on test day. And so the people who end up doing significantly worse on test day than they did on practice exams are generally letting their nerves get to them. And so if you struggle with that kind of stuff, then I think you have to have a plan for how you're going to walk into test day as calm and as confident as possible. Especially with a global pandemic, that becomes even harder. But, and this is kind of outside the studying for the LSAT thing, but that's about managing stress and anxiety. And you know yourself best. So maybe exercise is how you manage stress and anxiety. Maybe you should step that up. You should eat right. You should take vitamins, meditate, visualize success. These are all strategies that people have to cope with stress. But no, it is not the case that you should just expect that your LSAT score on test day will be lower than your practice exams. I am taking the LSAT in 6 months. How many hours a week would you recommend studying? Also, is there a limit maximum you would suggest? Well, yeah, if you're studying for the LSAT over a 6-month period, that's what, 26 weeks? I mean, I think you can study, 6 to 8 hours a week would probably be fine. The only thing about studying less than 10 hours a week is, are you studying enough for it to stick? You don't want to just, because you have so much time, spread it out so far that you're not internalizing things. So I would probably try to keep it at 10, and maybe especially, you can kind of dial that back a little toward the end if you're starting to get burnout. You might also want to carve out a break in there somewhere, a week where you just get rid of the LSAT, because studying for the LSAT for 6 months is a long time and sucks. Covered that. Do you have advice for burnout? Well, those things I was just talking about are the advice that I have for burnout. One is taking a break. If you're studying for the May LSAT Flex, which is next week, you might not have time to do that, but taking 1 or 2 or even 3 days off is important. All of those other stress management strategies, I think, are important. Those also include things like cutting toxic people out of your life and also relying on the people who are non-toxic, making sure to ask for help when you need it. Just all of those kind of best practices for not getting burned out at a job, I think, are also true for the LSAT. It can also be helpful to kind of switch up what you're studying. So maybe one day is games, one day is reading comp, one day is logical reasoning, rather than having the same like day in, day out. It's hard not to get burned out studying for the LSAT. It takes a lot of time and it's easy to get burned out. Is it true the logic game section will be removed from the exam? Yes, but I think it's a couple of years from now. They're not doing it anytime soon. Do we know what will happen after this removal in terms of section and even test length timing? I'm guessing there will just be one less section and the LSAT will be just like it was, but I don't think they've actually gotten that far, or at least they have not announced anything yet. How much should we prepare for the writing sample? What is the best way to prepare? So there's actually an LSAT Max lesson on the writing sample. The writing sample, I think you should not worry too much about. So what happens with the writing sample is that you are given a prompt where a person or an organization is trying to decide between two different courses of action. And it's your job to basically be the lawyer or counselor for that person or advisor for that person, and that you are going to choose one of those two options and argue for that option and argue against the other one. They're going to give you a set of criteria that you should fashion your arguments around. I think for the most part, as long as you follow the instructions, it's one of the less important parts of your application package. I think it would be good to do a couple just to get used to the process. But also, since you can take the writing sample up to a year after the LSAT, I don't think you need to study for it while you're studying for the LSAT. So you can do it later. Another great reason why LSAT Max's lifetime access is for you. Since July of 2019, LSAT is offered on a tablet. How does that work? Both question and answers are presented through the tablet. Yes, since July of 2019, the LSAT is a tablet exam, although the LSAT Flex is a desktop or laptop exam. It's a little not great because you can't write on the exam. You will get scratch paper with the material, and this is true of the information for logic games, reading comp, and logical reasoning. You will get the ability to underline using your stylus, and I think 3 highlighter colors, and that's it. I think especially with reading comprehension, you need a note-taking system to make sure that you're not missing stuff. But that is the way that it works. If you sign up for LSAT Max, like I was saying, our interface is identical, functionally identical to the LSAT one. And so that will be helpful for you. Wait, the LSAT is at home now? Yes. The LSAT Flex in May and June is a home exam. It may not be afterward. Can you get accepted to a law school prior to completing the writing portion since we have a year to complete it, or must it be done and turned in before acceptance? Law schools will not review your application until it's complete. I think that law schools can determine whether or not they require a writing sample. And so what you want to do is go look at the website of or call them of the law schools you're interested in and see. If it is a required part of your application, then it has to be in, or they will not look at your application. If it's not, then you don't have to worry about it. If we never finish the writing sample for a test we took, does our score still get sent out? I'm pretty sure the score is still sent out, yes. Again, I think it depends upon the school's requirements. Some of them require the writing sample, some don't. Asking because it would be a great loophole for a score someone didn't do well on to never be seen. I really wish that that was the case, that you could just hide your score like this, but I don't think that's going to work, unfortunately. Do you think LSAT Flex will occur in August, October? I think July, yes. I think August, there's a good chance. October, maybe. I mean, that's still a ways away. That's 5 months. Maybe by then things will have changed. But I mean, the question you have to ask yourself, or that the makers of the LSAT have to ask themselves, is, do we have what it takes to gather scores or hundreds of people together and make sure that they're not getting infected with the coronavirus? And right now, I don't think they have an answer for that. And they may be working hard on it, but I have not heard of how they are going to address that. I mean, I'm guessing it would have things to do with, like, you know, less people per room, sitting you farther apart, but it's still a logistical nightmare. So I think it's very possible that you will have an LSAT Flex in August, and I would not rule it out in October either. Is it required that you have your bachelor's in hand before taking the LSAT? No, you can take it before you get your bachelor's degree. Will these slides be available to us after the presentation? I do not believe so, unfortunately. They were good slides, though. Do you think we should study? I think I more or less answered this question. Yes, I think studying for the LSAT Flex is about the same, just maybe kind of rejigger the amount of time you're spending on logical reasoning a little bit less, but it is all the same stuff. Do you think the LSAT Flex will be considered differently by law schools? Might the scores be higher in the LSAT Flex, raising the national average, making the scores from earlier or later tests look worse? To take that second question first, I think they're going to continue to do test equating, which means that they're going to be curving the exam against older LSATs, meaning that the curve should not be too much different than other LSATs. And so even if the test is easier in that, I don't know, like you get a higher percentage of questions correct, would be the way that I would think a test would be easier, they're just going to tighten the curve and make the curve harder. So I don't think that's the case. I also think schools are going to be pretty open about accepting LSAT Flex and just treating it like the LSAT. The LSAT Flex is still going to be a very difficult exam because those 3 LSAT sections, that stuff is hard. And it doesn't automatically become easy because you're doing it on a computer at home. And in fact, it might become harder. And I really think more broadly speaking, law schools are going to be very understanding about this time period. That includes something like, and I may get this question later, taking classes pass, not pass this semester. So I've gotten that question a lot. Are schools going to be mad if I take all my classes pass, not pass this semester? I don't think so. I think schools are going to be understanding, and what they're looking at is, you know, are you reacting reasonably to a crisis? And I think even more so than other schools, and now I'm talking more about the, you know, pass, not pass stuff, but even more than other schools, what law schools are looking for, what they're training you for ultimately, is to be an advisor to someone else, to help other people manage risk. And so if your application shows that you are managing risk well, including like taking pass, not pass classes to protect your GPA, I think that actually will look good to them because it looks like you're thinking the way that a lawyer should think. So I can't climb into the heads of any admissions officers. Maybe there are some of them out there who will think that the LSAT Flex is a joke, but I really do think that they're not going to penalize people for taking the LSAT Flex. So I don't think you should worry about it. How important are your recommendation and personal statement? If you score above the median, is it a good chance you will be accepted? So here's a really brief rundown of how I think law school admissions works, which is there's a first phase where they look at your GPA and their LSAT and they say, are these scores that we want to report to the American Bar Association or not? And they make an initial decision to put you in a yes, no, or maybe pile on the basis of that. If you are like just blowing away all their numbers in LSAT and GPA, then probably the rest of your application package doesn't matter. If you're well below LSAT and GPA median, they're just going to reject you out of hand, and all that other stuff doesn't matter. All the stuff like personal statement and letters of recommendation become extraordinarily important if you're in the maybe pile, because that's when they really start digging through that stuff and comparing you to other applicants in the maybe pile. And so I think it is important, but you just have to understand when it becomes important. It becomes important in that second phase. But I do, and those two I think are the most important, your personal statement and letters of recommendation. They'll also ask for a resume and, you know, sometimes some additional essays or something like that, but those are very important. I have already taken my LSATs twice after taking Kaplan's class test prep. Both times I scored in the 140s. I'm curious what I should take my target score, what is realistic. Obviously, I'd like it to be a 180. I mean, I think your target score you have to set for the schools that you're interested in. Without just being totally mean to Kaplan, I think Kaplan and Princeton also are poor systems, because I think what they do is generic test prep. I don't think they really focus in on LSAT specifically. Instead, they say, we do test prep. Here's one of a million tests that we prepare you for. So I mean, 180 is nearly impossible. I still couldn't get a 180, and I've been teaching this stuff for years. But I wouldn't say that you're stuck in the 140s. You know, look at the median LSAT for the schools that you want to go to, and you know, put your best foot forward and get a system that works, and the sky is the limit. Do you recommend any free LSAT study materials, websites, or YouTubes? Well, I do recommend the LSAT Max YouTube. It is very helpful. I know there are a lot of different systems out there. There are some, like, I think there are some good independent websites that can kind of just give you a rundown on the different ones. Like, I know Law School Transparency is a good one, and I think they have some good information on comparing different free materials. I recommend the free portions of the LSAT Max app. How are we doing on time? We're going to get through a couple more questions, and then I'm going to have to let you go. Let's see. How can students who are not a philosophy major get more experience and work on this area, such as what books to read, videos to watch, or study? Well, if you're talking about those like foundational concepts of argumentation, there are, you know, even like Wikipedia, if you just go look at common fallacies, they have a list that's just forever long. That can be helpful. But really, like, the point I made about being a philosophy major is that you will have already prepared for the LSAT somewhat by doing that. But you don't have to do philosophy to prepare for the LSAT. If you're taking a course, you should get prepared for the LSAT. A couple more. Is LSAT Max working on a practice LSAT Flex test? Oh, even better than that. We've actually made it. This is only through the web portal. This doesn't work on the app, but you can't take the LSAT Flex on a mobile device, which is the reason we didn't put it on the app. But every single LSAT in the history of the exam, we've provided for you to take an LSAT Flex format. So you can take any of our old LSATs as an LSAT Flex, and we will give you a score that should reasonably relate to the score that you would see on the LSAT Flex. I've registered for the July 13 test in order to get the Flex exam. I'm uncertain I will be ready. I've dedicated 5 hours a day for studies. Is it practical for me to stick with that date or move to the August 31st test date? That's, I mean, that's 2 months away. That much study time, 5 hours a day, I think it's possible to be ready by July 13th. I think it is kind of cutting it close, but I also am not sure if the August is going to be a flex, and I don't even know if July is going to be a flex. They haven't said that July is a flex yet. So if you definitely want to take the flex exam, I'm not 100% certain that you will actually be able to do that. That said, if this is your first time taking the exam, I think most people take the exam twice. I took it twice. And so you can take the July exam, and if you don't feel like it went well for you, then I think you can take it again, which would not be a problem. Is it possible to increase your score by 40 plus points? It is really hard, but it is possible. Obviously, if you are starting at 140 or above, it's not possible because that would be a 180 plus score. I think, if I remember correctly, the student that I saw the biggest increase with had a 36-point increase. It's not easy, but it is possible. Can you release only best LSAT scores to schools? No, they will get all of them. I'm sorry. I wish that was not the case. but they will get all of them. I'm going to find one more, and then I'm going to have to let you go. But let's find a good one. I'll just answer this one because I think it's helpful. Since this is no longer a pen and paper exam, do you have any advice for taking notes while reading a passage? Do you read the questions first? I do not read the questions first. Timing is difficult enough with reading comprehension without reading the questions first. I think it's fine, I guess, to glance at them. And if there's one that gives you a line reference, like why did the author say blah, blah, blah at line 37? Then maybe make sure that you're reading extra careful when you get there. But I would not read the questions first. I don't think that's helpful. What I do is that I will actually, and here is my screen still shared. Well, what I will do personally is that on my scratch paper, I'll just write out lines, like lines for paragraph 1, lines for paragraph 2, lines for paragraph 3, and then I'm tagging that on my scratch paper as I'm reading through the passage. And what you should always be focusing most on is what are the pieces of the argument that I'm reading? So in any paragraph, you're probably going to find a conclusion, a premise that supports a conclusion somewhere, or a criticism. All of those are important to argumentation. And so I think you have to be tagging those things and noting them. And hopefully you can come back to your tags on your scratch paper rather than having to go back and read the passage. I don't know, I think they really kind of screwed you guys over with reading comprehension specifically by making it so that you can't tag the passage on the exam. But I think you have to do that somehow. Otherwise, I think it's important at the very least to write down the pieces of the argument as you're going through the passage. So just like, oh, paragraph 1, I know I saw the author's main conclusion. Paragraph 2, I saw an experiment. But I think that's the best advice that I can give you. All right, so we are at about a half an hour out from our hour presentation. So unfortunately, I'm going to have to let all of you guys go. I hope this presentation has been useful for you. And I hope you have both a good idea of what the amount of work is that you have ahead of you, and that it will also hopefully make you optimistic that the work is doable, even if it is difficult. One more thing, I think on Thursday, I'll be giving another presentation about financing law school. If you want to come out of law school without being totally broke, that information might be helpful for you. So check into that one. But regardless, thank you guys so much for tuning in and paying attention. I appreciated all of your questions, and I'm really sorry that I was unable to get to all of them. But please stay safe, stay healthy, study hard, and hopefully I will see some of you guys soon. Take care.